Welcome to Vesper Shroud. I am about to tell you 9 stories that will fundamentally change how you see Alaska, small towns forever. These aren't fictional tales. They re-documented accounts from people who witnessed paranormal horrors so disturbing that authorities spent decades trying to bury them. A processing plant where dead fishermen still clock in. A town that vanished without explanation. Voices frozen in glacial ice for 35 years. By the end of this video, you'll understand why certain places in Alaska should never be visited alone. Stay until the very end. I promise you the final story will shake you to your core. This is Vesper Shroud. Let us begin. Story 1. Night shift. What would you do if you punched out at the end of your shift and saw time cards for dead people hanging on the rack? Freshly stamped with today, this date. My name is David Torres. I managed the Pacific Star processing plant in Dutch Harbor, Alaska for 6 years. I've worked in the fishing industry my entire adult life, 15 years on boats before I moved to management. I've seen men die at sea. I've seen what the ocean does to people who don't respect it. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered about the night shift at my own facility. Dutch Harbor is one of the busiest fishing ports in America. During peak season, our plant processes millions of pounds of fish every week. It's hard, cold, dangerous work that runs 24 hours a day. The night shift is always the hardest to staff because nobody wants to work midnight to 8 in a freezing facility while the rest of the world sleeps. I first noticed something strange in November 2022. I did come in early one morning around 5 to deal with equipment issues, and I stopped by the time clock to check who was working. That is when I saw them. 5 time cards punched in for the night shift, but I only had 4 people scheduled. The extra card belonged to someone named Miguel Santos. The name wasn't too familiar. So I checked our employee database. No Miguel Santos in the system. No record of him ever working at Pacific Star. But his time card showed he punched in at midnight and was currently on shift. I walked through the processing floor looking for this mystery employee. The place was massive, full of conveyor belts and sorting stations and the constant noise of machinery. But I found my 4 scheduled workers exactly where they should be. No 5th person. No Miguel Santos. When I asked the night crew about it, they got quiet. Exchanged looks. Finally, the shift supervisor, a woman named Karen who worked at the plant for 12 years, pulled me aside and said we needed to talk privately. She took me to the break room and told me about the accident from 2012. A fishing vessel called the Nordic Star had gone down in a storm about 40 miles offshore. All 8 crew members died. The bodies were never recovered, swallowed by the Bering Sea like so many others before them. 6 of those crew members had worked at Pacific Star during the off-season. Miguel Santos was one of them, and according to Karen, their time cards had been showing up punched in on the night shift for the past 10 years. Not every night, but often enough that the night crew had learned to expect it. I thought she was messing with me, playing some elaborate prank on the new manager who had only been there 8 months. But Karen, his face was dead serious. She told me the night shift workers all knew about it, knew about the tools that moved on their own. The freezer doors that slammed shut when nobody was near them. The sounds of footsteps on the metal walkways when everyone was accounted for below. She said the crew from the Nordic Star had never left. They'd come back to the only other home they'd known. And they were still working their shifts. I checked the time card records going back years, found exactly what Karen described. Random dates where extra cards appeared, always punched in at midnight, always belonging to one of the 6 dead crew members. The cards would vanish by morning, like they never existed. But someone was punching them in. Something was. I started staying late, watching the night shift, trying to find a rational explanation. For the first week, nothing unusual happened. The crew worked, the machines ran. Everything was normal except for the occasional time card that appeared and disappeared. Then I saw him. It was 2 in the morning. I was in the manager's office overlooking the processing floor when I noticed someone working at the freezer entrance. A man in a yellow rain suit and rubber boots, standard gear for processing work. He was moving fish crates from a pallet to a dolly, routine work. But nobody was scheduled for that area. I checked the floor assignments. Everyone was supposed to be on the main conveyor lines. I grabbed my radio to ask who moved stations without authorization, but before I could call, the man in yellow looked up at me. His face was gray, not pale or tired, gray like old meat, and his eyes were empty. Just dark holes where eyes should be. He stared at me for 3 seconds, expressionless, then turned and walked into the freezer. I ran down to the floor, reached the freezer in under a minute. The door was closed but not locked. I yanked it open and felt the blast of Arctic air that kept the freezer at 20 below. The space was huge, rows of shelving holding pallets of frozen fish. The man in yellow was gone, but the dolly he'd been loading was there, fully loaded with crates. Fresh work, done in the last few minutes. I checked with the night crew. Nobody had been near the freezer. Everyone was accounted for on the main floor. I looked at the time clock on my way back upstairs. Miguel Santos, his card was punched in. Current time showed 2 hours into his shift. I spent the next week reviewing security footage. The cameras covered most of the facility but had blind spots, including the area near the freezer entrance. But I found something that made my hands shake. On multiple nights over the past year, the footage showed brief anomalies. Shadows moving where no person stood. Doors opening and closing on their own. And once, for just 3 frames of video, a figure in yellow rain gear standing in the middle of an empty hallway. The night crew acted like this was normal. Karen said they learned to work around the dead crew members. You hear footsteps behind you and just keep working. A tool would move on its own and you find it where you needed it. The freezer door would slam shut and you wait a minute before opening it again, giving whoever was inside time to finish their work. They made peace with sharing their shift with ghosts. But I couldn't accept that 6 dead fishermen were still clocking in, still working, still performing tasks in my facility a decade after drowning in the Bering Sea. I started researching the Nordic Star accident, found newspaper articles and Coast Guard reports. The boat had been overloaded, taking a risk to maximize the catch before the season ended. They ignored weather warnings and pushed into a storm that should have sent them back to port. The last radio transmission from the captain mentioned ice building up on the deck, making the vessel top-heavy. Then silence. They died because of greed and impatience. Died doing dangerous work for money that didn't matter once the ocean claimed them. And somehow, they come back to the only other place they known. The processing plant where they worked during the off-season, where they'd been safe and warm and alive. But why were they still working? Why hadn't they moved on or faded away or done whatever ghosts are supposed to do? Karen thought they didn't. They were dead. That they drowned so quickly they hadn't realized what happened. And now they just kept showing up for their shifts like always. I found that hard to believe until the night I worked alongside Miguel Santos. It was December, 3 weeks before Christmas. The night crew was short-staffed because of the holidays, and I volunteered to help cover the processing line. I was working the sorting station around 3 a.m. when I felt someone next to me. Looked over and saw him. Miguel Santos, close enough to touch. He was sorting fish with mechanical efficiency, his gray hands moving in practice patterns. He didn't acknowledge me. Didn't seem to notice I was there. Just worked, his empty eyes fixed on the conveyor belt, his movements precise and steady. I stood frozen, watching him work. His rain suit was torn in places, and I could see gray-blue skin underneath. His boots were crusted with what might have been ice or salt. And he smelled like the ocean, not fish or processing chemicals. Just salt water and cold and the deep smell of things that live in the dark. We worked side by side for 10 minutes. I sorted fish on my section. He sorted on his. The other workers glanced over occasionally but didn't react. This was normal for them. Just another night sharing the shift with the dead. Then Miguel stopped. His hands went still on the belt. He turned his head slowly and looked directly at me. His empty eyes locked onto mine, and I felt something pass between us. Not communication exactly, more like recognition, like he was seeing me for the first time and realizing I didn't belong. His mouth opened. No sound came out, but I could read his lips. The same words over and over. Help us, help us, help us. The freezer door slammed behind me. The sound was so loud it echoed through the entire facility. When I turned back, Miguel was gone. Just empty space where he'd been standing. The conveyor belt ran on, fish sliding past, business as usual. I checked the time cards. 6 of them punched in. All 6 crew members from the Nordic Star working the same shift. All 6 dead for 10 years. The next morning, I started making calls. Contacted families of the Nordic Star crew. Asked questions about memorial services and burial sites. What I learned broke something in me. None of the crew had proper funerals. They couldn't. Without bodies. The families had held memorial services, but there were no graves, no physical places to mourn. The men had just vanished into the ocean. and their families had been left with nothing but memories and unanswered questions. I realized what Miguel had been asking for. Help us, not help with sorting fish or moving crates. Help with moving on, help with finding rest. They were trapped in a loop, showing up for work because they had nowhere else to go, no graves to return to, no final resting place that acknowledged their deaths. I organized a memorial, got permission from the families, held a service at the waterfront with 6 empty caskets that we lowered into symbolic graves at the Dutch Harbor Cemetery. We gave them headstones, names and dates, physical markers that said these men had lived and died and were remembered. The night after the memorial, I stayed at the plant, watched the time clock at midnight, waited to see if the cards would appear. The clock struck 12. The night crew punched in, 4 cards sliding into the rack. No 5th card, no 6th, no Miguel Santos or any of the other crew from the Nordic Star. I walked the processing floor. The machinery hummed. The crew worked, but the space felt different. Lighter somehow. The oppressive weight that had hung over the night shift was gone. The freezer door didn't T-slam. Tools stayed where they were put. Footsteps were only footsteps, made by living people with living purpose. Karen approached me near the end of the shift. Her eyes were wet. She said it felt different. Said the night shift had been haunted for so long they'd forgotten what normal felt like. And now it was normal again. The dead crew had moved on, given permission to rest by a memorial that acknowledged their deaths and gave them a place in the world they left behind. They didn't need to keep working anymore. Didn't need to keep showing up for shifts in a plant that couldn't pay them because they were already paid in full by the ocean. I left Dutch Harbor 6 months later, took a job in Seattle where the work is easier and the ghosts stay buried. But I think about those 6 men often, about how they'd been trapped between life and death, still trying to do their jobs because that was all they knew. And I think about all the other people who die at sea or in accidents or violence and never get proper burials. Never get their names on stones that say they existed and mattered. How many of them are still out there, trapped in the places they knew, trying to work or live or exist because nobody gave them permission to stop? So here's my question. If you died suddenly, violently, with no body recovered and no grave to mark your passing, would you be able to rest? Or would you keep showing up to work, to home, to the places you knew, looking for closure that never comes? Write your answer in the comments, because I think there are more night shifts like the one at Pacific Star. More dead people still clocking in, still trying to finish jobs they started in life. And I think they're all asking the same thing Miguel asked me. Help us find peace, help us finally rest. Story 2. What hunts Portlock? The entire town of Portlock, Alaska vanished in 1949. Not the people, the town itself. Every resident packed up and left within weeks, abandoning homes, businesses, and lives they had built for generations. They never spoke about why. But I found out, and now I understand why some places should stay abandoned forever. I am a wilderness photographer, and I had heard whispers about Portlock for years. The haunted fishing village on the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula. The place where something killed so many people that everyone just walked away. The locals in nearby towns would not talk about it. They would change the subject or end the conversation entirely. That terrifying silence made me obsessed. I needed to see Portlock for myself, to photograph the abandoned buildings and maybe understand what drove an entire community to flee in fear. The boat captain who took me there was a grizzled man named Tom. He agreed to drop me off only after I paid him triple his normal rate. He would not stay, would not wait. He gave me a satellite phone and told me to call when I was ready to leave, but the look in his eyes said he did not expect me to call. As we approached the coastline, he pointed to the mountain looming behind the ghost town. Murder Mountain, they call it now. 36 people died on that mountain or near it between 1920 and 1949. Loggers found torn apart. Fishermen discovered with their skulls crushed. Women and children who wandered too far from town and never came back. The scary part was that nobody ever found out what was doing the killing. Tom dropped me at the old dock and left before I even finished unloading my gear. I watched his boat disappear around the coastline, and suddenly I was alone in one of the most isolated places in Alaska. The silence hit me first. No birds, no insects, just the sound of waves lapping against rotting pilings and the creepy whisper of wind through empty buildings. Portlock looked like a town frozen in time. Houses with windows still intact. A collapsed cannery, rusted equipment scattered like bones. But everything felt wrong, like the place itself was holding its breath. I spent the first day photographing the ruins. The light was perfect, creating long shadows that made every structure look haunted and menacing. I found personal items left behind in the houses, dishes on tables, clothes in closets, children as toys abandoned in yards. These people had left in such a hurry they took only what they could carry. In one house, I found a journal belonging to a woman named Sarah. The last entry was dated March 15th, 1949. It said, "It took Jensen last night. We heard him screaming for 20 minutes. When we found him this morning, there was nothing left but his boots and blood in the snow. We are leaving tomorrow. God help anyone who stays." The entry sent ice through my veins. I photographed it, but something made me pocket the journal instead of leaving it behind. As sunset approached, I set up camp in what used to be the general store. The building had a good roof and solid walls. I figured it was safer than the houses. I was wrong about so many things that day. Night fell fast in Alaska. By 6 p.m., darkness swallowed the town completely. I sat in my sleeping bag editing photos on my laptop when I heard the first sound. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, walking through the town outside. My rational mind said it was just an animal. A moose. A bear. But the footsteps sounded wrong. The gait was too measured. Too purposeful. And they stopped directly outside the general store. I turned off my laptop and sat in the darkness, barely breathing. The footsteps circled the building. I heard something sniffing at the gaps around the door. Deep, wet breaths that sounded disturbingly loud in the silence. Then came the scratching. Long, scraping sounds against the wood, like something with claws was testing the strength of the walls. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would burst. Every scary story I had ever heard about Portlock crashed through my mind. The hairy figure seen on the mountain. The monstrous shape that stalked loggers through the forest. The thing that could tear a man apart with its bare hands. The scratching stopped. For 5 minutes, there was nothing. Then I heard it moving away, footsteps fading toward the base of Murder Mountain. I did not sleep that night. I sat with my back against the wall, clutching my satellite phone, trying to convince myself it had been a bear. But bears do not circle buildings like predators sizing up prey. And bears do not walk with footsteps that sound almost human. Dawn came as a relief. I packed up immediately, ready to call Tom and leave this horrifying place behind. But when I stepped outside, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Tracks, massive footprints in the dirt outside the general store, circling the entire building exactly where I had heard the footsteps. They were not bear tracks. Not moose. Not anything I recognized. They looked almost human but far too large. 18 inches long, 5 toes, deep impressions that suggested immense weight. And they led straight toward Murder Mountain. I should have called for pickup right then. Instead, I followed the tracks. I told myself I needed proof. I needed photographs that would validate the stories and show the world what really happened in Portlock. But the truth was darker. I was drawn to follow those tracks the same way people are drawn to look over the edge of cliffs. Fear and curiosity twisted together into something that overrode common sense. The trail led into dense forest at the base of the mountain. The trees grew so thick that daylight barely penetrated. I marked my path carefully, leaving bright orange tape on branches every 50 feet. The tracks were easy to follow through the soft forest floor. Whatever made them was heavy enough to sink deep into the earth with each step. I found claw marks on trees 10 feet up, gouges in the bark that looked fresh. And everywhere, that disturbing sense of being watched by something that knew these woods far better than I ever could. 2 miles in, I found the cave. The entrance was partially hidden by fallen trees and dense brush, but the tracks led directly inside. The opening was large, easily 10 feet high and twice as wide. The smell that wafted out was nightmare fuel. Rot, decay, the eerie stench of death that had been accumulating for years. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I saw something just inside the entrance that made me move closer. Bones, hundreds of them, piled in the shadows like offerings to some terrible god. I turned on my flashlight and stepped inside. The cave extended back further than my light could reach, disappearing into absolute darkness. The bones covered the floor, deer, moose, seal, and mixed among them, unmistakably human. Skulls crushed, ribs snapped, long bones cracked open to get at the marrow. This was a feeding ground, a lair, and I was standing in it like the world's biggest idiot. That was when I heard the breathing, deep, rhythmic, coming from the darkness at the back of the cave. Something massive was in there with me. Something that had been sleeping and was now waking up because I had invaded its territory. I backed toward the entrance slowly, trying not to run, trying not to trigger the chase instinct I knew was building in whatever shared this space with me. I made it 5 steps before it moved. The sound was like nothing I had ever heard. A roar that was part human scream and part animal rage. It echoed through the cave, shaking loose dirt from the ceiling. I ran. Pure terror drove me back through the entrance and into the forest. Behind me, I heard it coming, crashing through the undergrowth, moving fast, too fast for something so large. I did not look back until I reached the tree line where the forest opened onto the abandoned town. When I finally turned, I saw it clearly in the afternoon light. The thing from the cave. The creature that killed 36 people and drove an entire town away in fear. It stood at the edge of the forest, partially hidden by shadows but visible enough. 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair, arms too long for its body, a face that looked almost human but twisted into something that belonged in nightmares. And its eyes, God, its eyes, they held an intelligence that was more horrifying than any mindless beast. It was not just hunting. It was thinking, planning, remembering every human who had ever invaded its territory. We stared at each other across 100 yards of open ground. I raised my camera with shaking hands and took 3 photos. The creature watched me do it. Then it did something that made my skin crawl. It smiled. Not a friendly expression, a predator. A smile. The look of something that knew I was trapped on its island with nowhere to run. It retreated into the forest. I fumbled for my satellite phone and called Tom. He answered on the first ring. His voice was tense. He had been waiting for my call, waiting to hear if I was still alive. He said he could be there in 4 hours. I told him to hurry. I told him something was hunting me in Portlock, and it was only a matter of time before it decided to finish what it started. Those 4 hours were the longest of my life. I barricaded myself in the general store again, piling anything heavy against the doors and windows. As darkness fell, I heard it return. The footsteps, the breathing, the scratching. But this time it was different, more aggressive. It was not testing anymore. It was trying to get in. The wood around the door started to splinter. The walls shook with impacts that sounded like sledgehammers. I huddled in the corner, watching my barricade slowly fail, knowing that when it broke through, I would die the same way 36 others had died on Murder Mountain. Then I heard the boat horn. Tom had arrived early, and he was announcing his presence like a cavalry charge. The attacks on the building stopped immediately. I heard the creature's footsteps retreating toward the mountain. I grabbed my gear and ran for the dock, not caring about anything I left behind. Tom had the boat running, ready to leave the second I was aboard. As we pulled away from Portlock, I looked back and saw the creature standing on the beach. Watching, waiting, knowing that someday, someone else would come. Someone else would ignore the warnings and the fear. And it would be ready. I made it home. I developed my photos. They showed exactly what I saw. The massive footprints, the cave full of bones, and 3 clear shots of the creature itself. I tried to publish them. Contacted magazines, news outlets, scientific journals. Everyone rejected them. Too scary, too disturbing. Or worse, they claimed the photos were hoaxes. But I know the truth. I lived it. Portlock remains abandoned. The buildings continue to rot into the forest. And on Murder Mountain, something still hunts. Something that has been there longer than any town or any human settlement. The natives knew about it centuries before white fishermen built Portlock. They called it Nantinaq, the thing that stalks. They avoided the area entirely because they understood what we had to learn through blood and death. Some places belong to forces older and more terrifying than civilization. Some mountains are called Murder Mountain for reasons that transcend legend. I still have the journal I found. I still have my photos. And every night, I dream about those eyes watching me from the forest. That chilling smile. That terrible intelligence that recognized me not as a threat but as prey that temporarily escaped. I know I was lucky. I know 36 others were not. And I know that whatever hunts Portlock is still there, waiting in the darkness and the silence, for the next person foolish enough to visit the ghost town that fear built and horror abandoned. Story 3. Coughing Place. I heard 47 men coughing in perfect synchronization in the burned ruins outside Seward, Alaska. All at once, the same wet, rattling cough that comes from lungs destroyed by years of breathing coal dust and chemicals. The terrifying part is that those men have been dead for 60 years. They died screaming in a fire that was no accident. And now they want someone to know the truth. My name is David, and I am a documentary filmmaker specializing in forgotten American history. I came to Seward to investigate the Resurrection Bay Rehabilitation Center, a facility that operated from 1958 to 1964. Officially, it was a place where miners recovering from lung disease could rest and heal. Unofficially, according to rumors I found in old newspaper archives, It was something much darker. A place where mining companies sent workers who knew too much about safety violations and toxic exposure. A place where men went to be silenced permanently. The center burned down on March 7, 1964, the same day as the massive Good Friday earthquake that devastated Alaska. 47 patients died in the fire. The official report blamed the earthquake for rupturing gas lines, but several survivors claimed the doors were locked from the outside. They said they heard staff evacuating hours before the quake hit, heard vehicles leaving, heard the building being sealed shut with them trapped inside. Their testimony was dismissed as trauma and confusion. The investigation closed within weeks. The mining companies that funded the facility faced no consequences. I hiked up to the ruins on a gray October morning. The rehabilitation center was built 5 miles outside Seward, deep in the forest where the screams would not carry to town. The trail was overgrown and barely visible. Clearly, not many people visited anymore. Local hikers I spoke with in town gave me the same warning. Stay away from the old rehabilitation center. Strange things happen there, sounds that should not exist. Shapes moving through the burned wreckage. An overwhelming sense of rawness that makes you want to run. I ignore the warnings because I always do. That is how you get good footage. How you find the stories that matter. I brought my camera equipment, my audio recorder, and enough gear to spend the full day documenting the site. I expected to find ruins, maybe some eerie atmosphere. What I found was something that has destroyed my ability to sleep through a single night without waking up in cold sweat. The building was a skeleton. Blackened beams jutted from the forest floor like broken ribs. Sections of concrete foundation remained, cracked and buckled from the earthquake. Nature had reclaimed most of it. Trees grew through what used to be rooms. Moss covered everything in a thick carpet of green. But despite 60 years of decay, you could still see the layout. Long corridors, small rooms with barred windows, a central administrative building, and at the far end, what looked like isolation wards with steel doors still hanging from twisted hinges. I started filming immediately. The place had an oppressive atmosphere that my camera captured perfectly. The light seemed dimmer here, even though we were in an open clearing. The forest around the ruins was silent. No birds, no squirrels, no wind, just that creepy, heavy stillness that makes your ears ring and your skin crawl. I documented every section methodically, narrating the history, describing the architecture, building my documentary piece by piece. Around noon, I reached the isolation ward section. 6 small rooms built with reinforced concrete walls. The steel doors were scorched black but intact. Inside each room, I found the same disturbing details. Restraint points bolted into the walls, drains in the center of the floor, scratch marks on every surface, deep gouges where fingernails had clawed at concrete in desperation. These were not healing rooms. These were cells, places where men were kept locked away from the world while whatever was making them sick finished its work. I was photographing the scratch marks when I heard the first cough. Wet, rough, the sound of lungs struggling to function through layers of scarred tissue. It came from behind me, from one of the other isolation rooms. I turned, expecting to find another hiker, but the ruins were empty. I called out, no response, just that eerie silence pressing back in. Then I heard it again. Another cough, from a different room, then another, and another. Within seconds, I was surrounded by coughing sounds coming from all 6 isolation rooms simultaneously. Perfectly synchronized, all the same rhythm, all the same terrible, wet sound of dying lungs trying to clear themselves. It went on for 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. Absolute silence again. My rational mind said it was wind through the ruins. Echo effects, my imagination. But my hands were shaking as I checked my audio recorder. I had captured it, clear and undeniable. Synchronized coughing from 6 different locations. I played it back. The sound made my stomach turn. There was something human in those coughs. Something aware. Something that wanted to be heard. I should have left then. Should have packed up my equipment and hiked back to Seward. But I needed to understand what I had recorded. I searched through the ruins more carefully, looking for any explanation. In what used to be the administrative building, I found a metal filing cabinet that had somehow survived the fire. Inside were patient files, dozens of them. Water damaged and partially burned, but still readable. What I discovered made me physically ill. The rehabilitation center was running medical experiments. They were deliberately exposing patients to higher concentrations of mining chemicals and coal dust, documenting the progression of lung disease, testing how much exposure a worker could survive before becoming unable to work. The mining companies were funding research to determine the minimum safety standards they could maintain without killing workers too quickly. These men were not patients. They were test subjects. And when they started asking questions or threatening to go public, they were moved to the isolation wards. One file described a patient named Thomas McKinley, age 42, coal miner for 18 years, diagnosed with pneumoconiosis, transferred to Isolation Ward 3 after threatening to contact newspapers about the center's true purpose. The final entry was dated March 6, 1964, one day before the fire. It simply said, "Subject shows continued resistance. Recommended for permanent removal." I found 46 more files with similar notes, all dated March 6th, all stamped with the same phrase, "Recommended for permanent removal." These men were marked for death the day before the earthquake. The fire was not an accident or an unfortunate consequence of the disaster. It was murder, a mass execution designed to look like a tragedy. I was photographing the files when the coughing started again, but this time it was different, louder, more insistent, and it was not coming from the isolation wards. It was coming from all around me, from every section of the ruins simultaneously. Dozens of voices coughing in perfect rhythm. I could hear the desperation in those sounds. The panic, the pain. They were not just coughing. They were trying to communicate, trying to tell their story the only way they could. I ran to the center of the ruins with my camera. I needed to capture this. I needed evidence that something impossible was happening in this place. The coughing grew louder as I filmed, echoing through the forest, a chorus of dead men making themselves heard. Then, through my viewfinder, I saw them. Shadows, human-shaped, standing in the doorways of the isolation wards. In the windows of the main building. Between the burned beams, dozens of shadow figures watching me with eyeless faces. They were not ghosts in the traditional sense. Not transparent or glowing. Just darkness in the shape of men. Solid enough to block light. Real enough to make footprints in the moss as they moved closer. The coughing was coming from them. From shadow lungs in shadow chests. And as they surrounded me, I understood what they wanted. They wanted their story told. They wanted the world to know they were murdered. That the mining companies killed them to hide evidence of criminal negligence. That their deaths were not a tragic accident but a calculated act of corporate violence. I kept filming, even as the terrifying shapes moved closer. Even as the temperature dropped and my breath turned to fog. Even as the coughing grew so loud it felt like my own lungs were seizing in sympathy. I filmed it all because these men deserved to have their truth documented. They died alone and afraid and silenced. I would not let them stay silent. Then one of the shadows reached out. Its hand passed through my camera, and I felt a sensation like ice water flooding my chest. Suddenly I could not breathe. My lungs locked up. I collapsed to the ground, gasping, drowning in air that would not enter my body. I experienced what they experienced. The suffocation, the panic, the horrible realization that no help was coming. That you were going to die slowly while people who could save you chose not to. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. When I could finally breathe again, the shadows were gone. The coughing had stopped. The ruins were just ruins again, empty and silent and sad. But my camera was still recording. And when I played back the footage later, I saw everything. The shadows, the synchronized coughing, the moment one of them touched me, all captured in perfect clarity. I brought the footage to news outlets, to investigators, to anyone who would listen. Most dismissed it as special effects or fabrication, but 3 people took me seriously. 3 investigative journalists who started digging into the rehabilitation center as history. They found evidence of financial connections between mining companies and the facility. Records of experimental treatments that were never approved by medical boards. Testimony from surviving staff members who admitted they were ordered to evacuate and lock the building before the earthquake hit. The story broke 6 months ago. It made national news for about a week. Mining companies issued denials and blamed everything on long-dead administrators. No criminal charges were filed because everyone directly responsible has been dead for decades. The story faded from headlines, but the truth is out now. Those 47 men are not forgotten anymore. Their names are known. Their murder is documented, and the rehabilitation center ruins outside Seward are now marked with a memorial plaque listing every patient who died in the fire. I visit sometimes, always during the day, always alone. I bring flowers and leave them at the central foundation. And sometimes, if the wind is right and the forest is quiet, I hear it. Faint and distant, the sound of synchronized coughing. But it is different now. Less desperate, less angry, more like acknowledgement, like they know someone finally listened, like they can rest now that the truth is not buried with them. But I cannot rest, because I learned something terrifying during my research. The Resurrection Bay Rehabilitation Center was not unique. There were 4 other facilities just like it scattered across Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. All operated by the same organization. All funded by the same mining companies. All closed under mysterious circumstances in the 1960s. And according to records I found, each one had patients who simply disappeared from documentation weeks before the facilities shut down. I know what happened to those people. I know there are more mass graves hidden in forests and mountains. More victims whose stories need to be told. More shadows waiting in abandoned ruins for someone to hear their final testimony. And despite the nightmares, despite the panic attacks, despite the sensation of suffocating that still hits me without warning, I am going to find them. I am going to document every site, every victim, every corporate crime that was hidden behind medical terminology and convenient disasters. The shadows at Seward taught me something. The dead do not rest when they die with secrets. They linger. They wait. They find ways to make themselves heard through the barriers of time and death. Those synchronized coughs were not hauntings. They were communication, a message sent across 60 years saying we existed, we suffered, we were murdered, remember us. I carry that message now, and I will carry it to every forgotten facility, every hidden grave, every place where workers were sacrificed to corporate profit and then erased from history. The shadows are watching, waiting, ready to share their truth with anyone brave enough or foolish enough to listen. I am both, and I am not stopping until every voice is heard, every name is known, every terrible secret is dragged into the light. Because that is what the dead at Seward taught me. Silence is a choice, and some silences need to be broken no matter how scary the truth might be. Even if it means hearing the coughing in my own dreams now. Even if it means feeling phantom hands reaching through my chest. Even if it means carrying the weight of all those deaths into whatever ruins I visit next. The shadows follow me now. Not threatening, not hostile, just there, in the corner of my vision, in the reflection of windows, standing silent in darkness, waiting to see if I keep my promise, waiting to see if I am worthy of the trust they placed in me when they let me live after showing me their truth. I will not let them down. I will document it all. And someday, when the full story is told and every hidden crime is exposed, maybe the coughing will finally stop. Maybe the shadows will fade. Maybe those 47 men and hundreds of others like them can finally rest. But until then, I listen, I record, I remember, and I make sure the world knows that some horrors are not supernatural. Some horrors are human, and those are the most terrifying of all. Story 4. Shadow that walks like a moose. I have not slept more than 2 hours at a time in 6 months. And when I do sleep, the nightmares show me things that are coming for all of us. They started the night I saw the shadow moose in the woods outside Talkeetna, Alaska. I know how that sounds. I know what you were thinking. But I was a wildlife photographer for 15 years, specializing in large mammals across North America. I have been charged by grizzlies, treed by wolves, and once spent 3 hours watching a bull moose tear apart my campsite. I know the difference between an animal and something else. And what I saw in those woods was something else wearing the shape of a moose like a costume made of darkness and malice. It happened last October during the peak of fall colors. I had driven up from Anchorage to photograph moose during rutting season, when the bulls are massive and aggressive and make for dramatic images. Talkeetna sits at the base of Denali, a small town that swells with climbers in summer and empties out in winter. October is the quiet time. The brief pause between tourist seasons when the locals reclaim their streets and the wilderness feels truly wild again. I set up camp about 8 miles outside town, off a logging road that petered into nothing but mud and rotting stumps. The forest up there grows dense and dark, spruce and birch crowding so close that daylight barely penetrates. Perfect moose habitat, perfect for photography, perfect for something else to watch without being seen. The first 3 days went normally. I captured good footage of several bulls sparring, their antlers cracking together like gunshots in the quiet. I documented a cow with twin calves, built my portfolio. Everything was professional and routine until the 4th night, when I woke to sounds outside my tent that made every hair on my body stand up. Footsteps, heavy footsteps circling my campsite. But the rhythm was wrong, the pattern too deliberate. Moose move with a distinctive gait, a certain weight distribution you learn to recognize. These steps were measured, careful, like something testing the perimeter, learning the boundaries. And they were silent between impacts. No crack of twigs, no rustle of undergrowth, just the periodic thud of something massive placing its feet with impossible precision. I lay in my sleeping bag, barely breathing, flashlight clutched in one hand and bear spray in the other. The circling continued for maybe 20 minutes before stopping directly outside my tent door. I could hear breathing then, deep and slow, but it sounded hollow, like wind through a cave rather than air through living lungs. The smell hit me next. Not animal musk, but something chemical and wrong, like ozone mixed with decay. The scent of a storm about to break mixed with old meat. Then it walked away, just turned and left, those same measured footsteps fading into the forest. I did not sleep the rest of that night. Sat with my back against my gear, every light I had burning, waiting for dawn. In the morning, I found the tracks. They surrounded my tent in a perfect circle. Each print sunk 8 inches deep into the soft ground. Moose tracks, unmistakably, split hooves, the right size and shape. But they were too perfect, too uniform, like something had studied moose prints and reproduced them exactly without understanding the small variations and irregularities of real animal movement. And where each print pressed into the earth, the grass had died, turned black and brittle as if burned by cold fire. I should have left, should have packed my gear and driven straight back to Anchorage. But I am a photographer, and photographers are curious by nature, drawn to the unusual. So I spent the day following those tracks deeper into the woods, my camera ready, telling myself I was documenting something scientifically important. The tracks led me 3 miles from camp to a clearing I had never seen before, though I had been working this area for days. The trees ringed it in a perfect circle, and nothing grew in the bare dirt at its center. No grass, no moss, nothing. And in that dead space stood the most horrifying thing I have ever witnessed. It had the shape of a bull moose. Massive rack spreading 8 feet across, body the size of a small car, legs like tree trunks. But it was made entirely of shadow, a 3-dimensional darkness that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Where it stood, reality seemed to bend, to blur at the edges like a photograph out of focus. I could see through it to the trees beyond, but those trees looked wrong, distorted, as if I was viewing them through dark water. The thing turned its head toward me with fluid, unnatural grace. Its eyes were worse than the rest. They glowed with a sick yellow light, not like animal eye shine, but like infected wounds in the fabric of the world. And when they locked onto me, I felt something crawl inside my skull. A presence that rifled through my thoughts like fingers through files. I ran, dropped my camera and ran faster than I thought possible, crashing through undergrowth, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. Behind me, I heard it following, those measured footsteps keeping perfect pace. It never rushed, never charged, just walked with patient certainty as if it knew I could not escape. That running was just a formality we both had to observe. I made it back to my truck somehow, fumbling with keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. As I drove away, I saw it standing at the edge of the logging road, watching me leave with those terrible yellow eyes. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that it had let me go. That it wanted me to leave. That seeing it was not the encounter but the beginning of something worse. The nightmares started that night. Not dreams but visions, crisp and detailed and impossible to distinguish from waking reality. I see the shadow moose walking through towns, through Talkeetna and beyond, spreading something like infection wherever its tracks fall. The ground dies, plants wither, and people who walk over those dead spaces start to change, their eyes taking on that same yellow glow, their movements becoming too precise, too measured. In the nightmares, I see dozens of them eventually, these shadow things wearing different shapes. Shadow bears, shadow wolves, shadow ravens the size of small planes. An army of darkness taking familiar forms, spreading through Alaska and beyond, converting the wilderness into something alien and hostile. And at the center of it all, the shadow moose walks, patient and purposeful, the first and oldest, the one that started the transformation. I wake from these nightmares screaming, drenched in sweat, convinced for several minutes that what I saw was real, that it has already happened. The line between sleep and waking has grown dangerously thin. Sometimes I am not sure which side I am on. I try to report it. Went to the authorities in Talkeetna. Tried to explain what I had seen. They listened with polite skepticism. Suggested I had encountered a normal moose in poor lighting conditions. That stress and isolation can play tricks on the mind. When I insisted, when I told them about the dead grass and the perfectly circular clearing, their expressions changed from skepticism to concern. For me, they thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe I am, Maybe that thing in the woods broke something fundamental in my brain, cracked my sanity like ice under pressure. But the nightmares feel too consistent, too detailed, too much like warnings rather than hallucinations. And I am not the only one who has seen it. I found others online, posting in obscure forums and conspiracy boards. A hunter near Talkeetna who came back from a trip speaking of a shadow bull that followed him for 3 days. A park ranger who quit her job after encountering something she refuses to describe in detail. A bush pilot who swears he saw it from the air, a moose-shaped hole in the forest canopy that moved against the wind. And we all have the nightmares now. Different details but the same core vision. The shadows spreading, taking more forms, moving beyond Alaska. Some of us have started seeing yellow glints in the eyes of normal animals. Started noticing that certain patches of forest feel dead in ways that have nothing to do with seasonal die-off. One woman in the group, a biologist who saw the shadow moose last summer, posted a theory before she disappeared. She believed it was not an animal at all but some kind of dimensional bleed. A place where our reality had worn thin and something from elsewhere was seeping through. The moose shape was just how our brains tried to process something fundamentally incomprehensible. She thought the nightmares were not side effects but messages, warnings from the parts of our mind that could perceive the true danger. She stopped posting 6 weeks ago. Her last message said the shadows were in her house, that she could see them moving in her peripheral vision, and that the shadow moose was standing in her backyard every night, waiting. No one has heard from her since. Local police did a wellness check and found her house empty. No signs of struggle, no indication where she went. Just dead patches on her lawn in the shape of hoof prints. I know I do not have much time left. The nightmares are getting stronger, more invasive. Last week, I woke up standing in my backyard in my underwear, the grass dead in a perfect circle around my feet. I have no memory of going outside, and yesterday, while driving through Seattle traffic, I saw it reflected in my rearview mirror. The shadow moose standing among the cars, those yellow eyes locked on mine. It is impossible. I am hundreds of miles from Talkeetna, in one of the most populated parts of Washington state. But distance seems to mean nothing to this thing. It exists outside normal rules, outside geography and probability. Once you see it, once it marks you with its attention, you belong to it regardless of where you run. I am writing this as a warning and a confession. If you ever travel to Alaska, if you ever find yourself near Talkeetna, stay on the main roads. Do not go into the deep woods alone. Do not follow strange tracks or investigate unusual clearings. And if you see a moose that seems too dark, too perfect, too aware, run immediately and do not look back. But honestly, I do not think it matters anymore. The shadow moose and its kind are spreading beyond Alaska, beyond the wilderness. I see signs everywhere now. Dead patches in urban parks. Animals that move with that same measured grace. People whose eyes catch the light wrong. The nightmares show me the end game. They show me cities overgrown with shadow, humanity transformed or displaced by things that wear our shapes the way the shadow moose wears the form of an animal. They show me a world where darkness is not the absence of light but a living force that consumes and replaces everything it touches. I do not know if I am going insane or if I am one of the few people seeing clearly. The other witnesses have mostly gone silent, disappeared, or stopped posting. I might be the last one still trying to warn people, still fighting the pull toward whatever waits in those nightmares. Tonight, I am going to try to stay awake. I have coffee, energy drinks, every stimulant I can find. Because the dreams are getting harder to wake from, and I am terrified that one night I will fall asleep and never come back. That I will join the others who saw the shadow moose and vanished into whatever darkness it represents. But I am so tired. 6 months of broken sleep, of nightmares that feel more real than waking life, have worn me down to nothing. My hands shake constantly. I see shadows everywhere, jumping at normal darkness, convinced every moose or deer or dog I glimpse is the beginning of something terrible. If you are listening to this, if I have disappeared by the time this recording surfaces, then you know the shadow moose is real. You know that something walks the woods of Alaska wearing familiar shapes, spreading darkness and nightmare wherever it goes. And you know that it is not confined to the wilderness anymore, that it is coming for all of us, patient and inevitable as death. The sun is setting now, and I can see my reflection in the window. But behind me, standing in my living room where nothing should be, I see it. The shadow moose, its yellow eyes glowing in the gathering dark. It has been here the whole time, just waiting for me to notice. The nightmares were never about the future. They were about now. They have always been about now. And I understand finally what it wants. What it has always wanted. It does not kill. It transforms. It opens eyes to realities that break human minds and remake them into something else. The witnesses did not disappear. They evolved. They saw clearly and joined the shadow. I am so tired of fighting. The darkness feels peaceful now. Inevitable. Natural. The shadow moose is not a monster but a messenger, showing us what we were always meant to become. I think I am ready to stop running. Story 5. Wrangell Petroglyph Curse. The petroglyphs started bleeding the night I helped move them, and by morning, 3 people were dead. My name is James Mitchell, and I am an archaeological consultant from Portland, Oregon. Last year, I was hired to assist the Wrangell Museum in relocating several ancient Tlingit petroglyphs from their original beach location to a climate-controlled facility. It seemed like a straightforward job, a chance to preserve important cultural artifacts while making decent money in one of Alaska's most beautiful small towns. What I participated in was not preservation. It was desecration, and the price we paid was beyond anything I could have imagined in my worst nightmares. Wrangell sits on an island in the Inside Passage, a fishing town of about 2,000 people surrounded by dense Tongass National Forest and frigid Pacific waters. The town is famous for its petroglyph beach, where ancient Tlingit people carved dozens of mysterious symbols into volcanic rocks scattered along the shore. Spirals, faces, creatures that might be whales or sea monsters, all etched into stone perhaps thousands of years ago by hands that understood something we have forgotten. The local Tlingit community had always maintained these petroglyphs were not mere art. They were protection, warnings, a barrier between the physical world and something else, something dark that lived in the waters and forests, something that had been contained by those carved symbols for generations beyond memory. When the museum board decided to relocate 6 of the most significant petroglyphs for a new exhibit, every Tlingit elder in town protested. They warned of consequences, of disturbing forces that had been carefully bound, of unleashing something that should remain sealed forever. The museum dismissed these warnings as superstition, concerned only with preservation and tourist revenue. I arrived in Wrangell on a gray October afternoon when the sky hung low and heavy, pressing down on the town like a physical weight. The project manager, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen from the University of Alaska, met me at the tiny airport. She seemed competent and professional, though I noticed a tension in her shoulders, a worried look she tried to hide behind scientific enthusiasm. She drove me directly to the beach where the petroglyphs waited. The moment I saw them, I felt something wrong. Not obviously wrong, not horror movie scary, but a subtle wrongness that made my stomach clench and my skin prickle. The carved rocks sat partially submerged at low tide, ancient symbols facing the sea, and there was a quality to them that transcended mere stone. They felt alive somehow, watchful, as if they were observing rather than being observed. Dr. Chen explained the relocation process. We would use specialized lifting equipment to carefully remove 6 specific petroglyphs, transport them to the museum, and install them in a custom-designed exhibit that would control temperature, humidity, and light exposure. Everything would be documented, measured, preserved for future generations. What she did not mention was that we would be breaking a seal that had held for perhaps 2,000 years. The work began at dawn 3 days later. A small crew of 5, including myself, Dr. Chen, 2 museum technicians, and a local contractor who had Tlingit heritage but needed the money badly enough to ignore his grandfather's warnings. His name was Thomas, and he looked sick from the moment we started, his face pale and drawn, eyes darting toward the forest that pressed close to the beach. The first petroglyph came free from its resting place with surprising ease, as if it wanted to be moved. A spiral design carved deep into volcanic rock, the lines worn smooth by centuries of tidal action but still clearly visible. As we loaded it onto the transport platform, I noticed something odd. The temperature had dropped suddenly, dramatically, despite the morning sun. My breath began to fog, and frost started forming on the exposed surfaces of the surrounding rocks. Dr. Chen noticed it too, but attributed it to some microclimate effect, a cold current from the deeper water perhaps. She ordered us to continue. By noon, we had removed 3 petroglyphs. And that is when things began to go terribly wrong. Thomas was the first to see it. He was standing near the water's edge, securing straps around the 4th petroglyph, when he suddenly froze and stared at the ocean. His face went completely white, his hands shaking so badly he dropped the tools he was holding. He pointed toward the water with one trembling finger. But when I looked, I saw only the usual gray swells rolling in from the Pacific. He insisted there was something in the water, something massive, just beneath the surface, watching us with intelligence and hunger. He described it as neither whale nor shark, but something else entirely. Something ancient and filled with terrible purpose. The rest of us saw nothing, but Thomas refused to go near the water after that. He sat on a log above the high tide line, wrapped in a blanket despite the fact that only he seemed cold, staring at the ocean with eyes that had seen something they could not unsee. We finished removing all 6 petroglyphs by late afternoon. As we loaded the final stone into the truck, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Every petroglyph we had removed showed fresh cracks that had not been there when we started. Not weather damage or natural erosion, but new fractures spreading through the ancient carvings like wounds opening in living flesh. And from those cracks, a dark liquid was seeping, not water from tidal exposure, not rust from iron deposits. This was thicker, darker, with a smell that reminded me of deep ocean trenches and things that have never seen light. The liquid seemed to move with a purpose of its own, flowing upward against gravity, pooling in the carved lines of the symbols as if trying to repair them, trying to seal what we had broken. Dr. Chen saw it too, but had no explanation. She ordered the petroglyphs covered with tarps and transported immediately to the museum. The urgency in her voice suggested she was beginning to understand we had made a terrible mistake. That night, the deaths began. The contractor who had helped us, a local man named Bill who had worked in Wrangell his entire life, was found dead in his house at 3 a.m. The police said it was a heart attack, but his wife told a different story. She claimed he had woken up screaming about something crawling through the walls, about ancient faces pressed against the windows, about water filling his lungs even though he was nowhere near the ocean. When they found him, his body was soaking wet, clothes drenched with salt water, even though every door and window in the house had been locked from the inside. The museum technician died before sunrise. Jessica, a young woman who had just finished her graduate degree, was staying at a bed and breakfast near the waterfront. The owner found her floating in the bathtub, drowned, her eyes wide open and staring at something invisible above her. But the tub had been empty when Jessica went to bed, and the water had never been turned on. Somehow, impossibly, she had drowned in a dry bathtub, her lungs full of salt water that tasted of depths no human has ever reached. Thomas, the Tlingit man who had seen something in the water, hanged himself from a tree in his backyard before dawn. He left no note, but his grandfather told the police that Thomas had called him around 2 a.m., babbling about the thing from the deep water coming for him, about owing a debt for betraying his ancestors, about needing to die before it took him another way. His body was found swaying in the morning breeze, and beneath him, the ground was soaked with salt water despite the fact that it had not rained and the ocean was half a mile away. 3 deaths in one night, all connected to the petroglyph relocation, all involving water in ways that made no scientific sense. The remaining crew members, myself and Dr. Chen, were questioned by the police but released. They had no evidence of foul play beyond the impossible circumstances. The official explanation was a series of tragic coincidences, perhaps carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty heaters, perhaps some environmental contamination. But I knew better. We had unleashed something, and it was systematically eliminating everyone who had participated in moving the petroglyphs. Dr. Chen wanted to return the stones immediately, to put them back exactly as we had found them. But when we went to the museum storage facility that afternoon, we discovered something horrifying. The petroglyphs had changed. New carvings had appeared on their surfaces, symbols that had not existed before. These were not weathered and ancient but freshly cut, the stones still bearing marks of recent carving despite the fact that the rocks had been locked in a secure facility overnight. And these new symbols were not protective wards like the originals. They were something else. Warnings, maybe, or accusations, or perhaps instructions written in a language that predated human speech. More disturbing was that the petroglyphs were still bleeding. That dark liquid continued to seep from every crack and crevice, pooling beneath the stones, spreading across the storage room floor in patterns that looked almost like words in an alphabet I did not recognize but that filled me with instinctive dread. Dr. Chen began to cry. She understood what I was only beginning to grasp. We had not just moved rocks. We had broken a barrier, and whatever the Tlingit people had sealed away 2,000 years ago was now free. That night, lying in my hotel room, I heard the ocean. This should not have been remarkable in a coastal town, but my hotel was 3 blocks inland, and the sound I heard was not the distant rumble of waves. It was the sound of water pressing against my door, against my windows, searching for a way inside. I could hear it breathing, if water could breathe, a wet rasping that came from everywhere and nowhere. I did not sleep. I sat in a chair with all the lights on, watching the door, watching the windows, waiting for the inevitable. Around 3 a.m., I saw it. A shadow moving across the window from outside, darker than the night, with a shape that was wrong in ways that made my eyes hurt to perceive. Not a person, not an animal, something that existed in a space between definitions, something the ocean had kept for millennia and the broken petroglyphs had released. The shadow paused at my window. I felt it looking at me, studying me with an intelligence that was vast and cold and absolutely inhuman. Then it moved on, and I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Wet footsteps, leaving puddles of salt water that I would later see with my own eyes. The footsteps stopped at Dr. Chen's room. I heard her scream once, a sound of pure terror that was cut off abruptly. Then silence, then the sound of water, gallons of it, flooding under her door and spreading down the hallway. I did not open my door. I sat frozen in that chair until sunrise, listening to the water recede, listening to the thing that had come for us return to whatever depths had spawned it. They found Dr. Chen in the morning. She was in her bed, completely dry, no sign of water anywhere in the room. But she was dead, her lungs full of salt water, her eyes wide open and staring at the ceiling, her mouth frozen in a final scream. The coroner would later report that the water in her lungs contained organisms that only exist at depths below 20,000 feet, in trenches where no light has ever penetrated, where things evolved in ways that defy understanding. I was the only one left, the only survivor of the team that had moved the petroglyphs, and I knew I was next. I went to see the Tlingit elders the next morning, desperate for any knowledge that might save me. An old woman named Margaret, whose grandfather had helped carve some of the protective symbols over a century ago, finally agreed to speak with me. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much sorrow and told me the truth. The petroglyphs were not Tlingit art. They were older, from a time before the Tlingit people came to these islands. They were carved by those who lived here first, by people who understood that the ocean was not empty, that things existed in its depths that watched the land with hunger and malice. The ancient ones had learned to trap these things, to bind them using symbols that connected to forces beyond human comprehension. For 2,000 years, those petroglyphs had held the barrier, but we had broken 6 of them, 6 holes in the seal, and something had come through, something that had waited with infinite patience for this chance. Margaret told me there was only one way to survive. I had to return the petroglyphs to their exact original positions before the next full moon, 3 days away. And I had to do it alone, without help, without witnesses, as a form of penance. If I succeeded, the barrier might reform. The thing might return to its prison. If I failed, it would take me like it had taken the others, and then it would be free to claim others, spreading across the island, perhaps eventually reaching the mainland. I spent 2 days planning, gathering equipment, waiting for the conditions to be right. The town wanted nothing to do with me. Word had spread about the deaths, about the curse, about my role in the desecration. Even the police seemed eager for me to leave, their questions perfunctory, their eyes avoiding mine. On the 3rd night, under a full moon that cast everything in silver light, I returned to the museum and loaded all 6 petroglyphs into a truck I had rented. The stones were heavier than they should have been, as if they resisted being moved again. The dark liquid still seeped from their cracks, more copiously now, pooling in the truck bed, and I could swear I heard sounds coming from the stones themselves. Not speech exactly, but a kind of resonance, a vibration that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I drove to the beach alone, arriving at low tide when the original positions of the stones would be exposed. The moon provided enough light to work by, painting everything in shades of gray and black. The ocean was unusually calm, too calm, as if it was waiting. I began the work of replacing the first petroglyph. It was brutally difficult alone, wrestling the massive stone into position, trying to align it exactly as it had been. The temperature dropped steadily as I worked, frost forming on exposed surfaces despite the fact that it was not cold enough for freezing. As I positioned the second stone, I felt the presence arrive. It emerged from the water without sound, without splash, a shape that was there suddenly as if it had always been there. Massive beyond description, dark beyond darkness, with a form that my mind struggled to perceive and tried desperately to forget. I forced myself not to look directly at it, focusing on the stones, on the work, on the task that might save my life. The thing watched me place the third petroglyph. I could feel its attention like weight on my back, like cold water filling my lungs. It was deciding whether to let me finish or to take me now. The fourth stone slid into position. The fifth. The temperature was now well below freezing, my hands numb, my breath coming in gasps that turned instantly to ice crystals. As I struggled with the sixth and final petroglyph, trying to align it perfectly in the moonlight, the thing moved closer. I could smell it now, the reek of deep ocean and ancient death, could hear the wet sounds of its movement, could sense its nearness like electricity in the air before a lightning strike. I positioned the final stone and stepped back. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the dark liquid seeping from the cracks began to glow with a faint phosphorescence. The glow spread from stone to stone, connecting them in a pattern I could see now for the first time, a design that was not 6 individual symbols but one massive ward, a seal that trapped something beyond the reach of land dwellers. The thing behind me screamed, not with voice but with a sound that existed in my mind, a shriek of rage and frustration that made blood run from my nose and ears. I felt it surge toward me, felt the cold water of its essence wrap around my legs, pulling me toward the ocean, toward depths that would crush and change me. Then the petroglyphs flashed with brilliant light, and the thing was gone. Pulled back, sealed away, trapped once more behind the barrier we had broken and I had rebuilt. I collapsed on the beach, shaking, bleeding, barely conscious. I must have lain there for hours because when I woke, the sun was rising and the tide was coming in. The petroglyphs sat exactly as they had for 2,000 years, showing no sign of damage, no cracks, no bleeding. They were whole again, and they were watching the ocean with eternal vigilance. I left Wrangell that day and never returned. The museum quietly canceled the exhibit. The official explanation blamed structural damage to the petroglyphs during preliminary assessment, claiming they were too fragile to move safely. No one mentioned the deaths. No one spoke about what we had unleashed and barely contained. But I know the truth. And sometimes, in my dreams, I still see that shape emerging from the dark water. I still feel its attention fixed on me, waiting with infinite patience for someone to break the seal again. Because now I understand what the Tlingit elders knew. Some things are imprisoned for good reason. Some barriers should never be crossed. And some prices, once paid in blood and horror, are never truly forgotten. Story 6. Barrow borrowed face. My wife came home from her walk on the tundra, and something about her face was wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not in a way that I could point to and say this feature or that feature doesn't match. It was subtly wrong, the way a photograph looks when the colors are slightly off, the way a song sounds when someone plays it in the wrong key. Everything was there. Everything was in the right place. But it wasn't her anymore. My name is James, and I lived in Barrow, Alaska, for 8 years. I am a wildlife researcher, here to study the Arctic ecosystems and document the changing patterns of migration and adaptation as the climate shifts. My wife, Sarah, moved here with me despite the endless darkness and the isolation. She is braver than me in a lot of ways, braver and more adventurous, which is exactly why she wanted to take a walk on the tundra alone that evening, even though I asked her not to. It was late October, when the sun had already started its final descent below the horizon. There would be no sunrise for the next few months. Barrow exists in a permanent state of twilight, a haunting, eerie darkness that never quite becomes complete night. The temperature was dropping below -10. The wind was picking up from the north, carrying the kind of cold that burns exposed skin in minutes. When Sarah said she was going for a walk, I told her she was crazy. The tundra wasn't safe, especially not in the darkness. Especially not alone. There were dangers out there that most people in the lower 48 never even considered. Hypothermia could kill you in under an hour. The terrain was treacherous, full of unexpected holes and frozen obstacles. And then there were the things that the old Inuit residents whispered about, the creepy, unsettling legends about the tundra and the things that waited in its vast, empty spaces. But Sarah had always been independent. She said the walk would only take an hour. She said she needed to feel the Arctic landscape to experience the sublime emptiness that the locals describe. She said she understood the risks and was accepting them. I watched her bundle up in her parka, pull her hood tight, and disappear into the darkness beyond our house. I waited. I told myself not to worry. Sarah was intelligent and cautious. She had taken a satellite messenger. She had told me her route. She would be back before nightfall, or at least before the darkness became complete. An hour passed, then 90 minutes, then 2 hours. I tried calling her. The satellite messenger showed her position, stationary about 2 miles from our house, somewhere out on the frozen tundra. When I finally reached her by radio, her voice sounded strange, distant, confused. She said she had gotten turned around, that the darkness was disorienting, that she needed help finding her way back. I grabbed my emergency gear and headed out into the barrow night. The cold was shocking, a physical force that seemed to suck the warmth from my body with every breath. I followed the GPS coordinates of her beacon, walking across the desolate landscape, my headlamp cutting through the darkness in a small, pathetic circle of light. I found her standing in the middle of the tundra, alone, motionless. She was facing away from me. When she heard my approach, she turned slowly. I called out to her, relief flooding through me, and she began walking toward me. The reunion should have been simple, but as she got closer enough for me to see her face clearly in the beam of my headlamp, I felt something fundamental shift inside my consciousness. Her face was familiar. All the features were correct. The nose, the eyes, the mouth, the distinctive freckles across her cheeks. But something about the overall arrangement, the subtle positioning of the elements, was off. It was like someone had studied her face carefully and then attempted to recreate it from memory, getting everything almost right but missing some ineffable quality that made it actually her. I didn't say anything about it that night. I convinced myself I was imagining things, that the stress and cold and fear were playing tricks on my perception. We walked back to the house in silence. Sarah seemed subdued, almost withdrawn. She showered, went to bed early, and slept without moving for 14 hours straight. But the wrongness didn't go away. Over the next few days, I became increasingly aware of the subtle alterations. The way she moved was almost right but not quite. The mannerisms were close but subtly different. She would tilt her head at angles that seemed slightly unnatural. Her laugh had a quality that was almost there but missing something essential. When she looked at me, her eyes were her eyes, but behind them was something that didn't quite understand what eyes were supposed to communicate. I started researching. I drove to the Barrow Town Library and began searching through old newspaper archives, through police records, through historical documents. What I found was terrifying and, paradoxically, somewhat validating. Cases going back decades of people returning from solo walks on the tundra with subtle but definite changes in their appearance or behavior. Families reporting that their loved ones seemed almost right but fundamentally altered. Medical examinations that found nothing wrong. Psychological evaluations that detected no abnormalities. The phenomenon had a name among the old residents, the borrowed face. The locals didn't talk about it openly, but the records were there if you knew how to look for them. At least 15 documented cases in the last 50 years. Some of the people who had returned with borrowed faces remained relatively normal, just slightly off in ways that family members noticed but couldn't explain. Others became increasingly strange, increasingly disturbing, until they eventually disappeared into the Arctic wilderness and were never seen again. The scariest part was the pattern. In almost every case, the person who returned from a solo walk on the tundra was someone who had been struggling psychologically. Someone dealing with depression or anxiety or isolation. Sarah had been struggling. The darkness was getting to her. She had mentioned wanting to feel something real, something genuine, out on the empty tundra. I should have stopped her. I should have been more forceful about the danger, but I had been distracted with my research, caught up in my work. Now my wife was returning home with someone else, this face worn over top of her own, and I had no idea what I was supposed to do about it. I made an appointment with Dr. Patterson, the only psychiatrist in Barrow. I told him about Sarah, his behavior, about the subtle changes I had noticed. He examined her thoroughly, asked detailed questions, and concluded that she was experiencing some mild effects from seasonal affective disorder, which was common in Barrow during the dark months. He recommended light therapy and vitamin D supplements. He acknowledged the wrongness of her face. Maybe he didn't see it. Maybe I was the only one who could perceive it. Sarah's behavior began to change more rapidly after that. She stopped going to work, claiming she was too tired. She spent entire days staring out the window at the frozen landscape. She would take walks at night, disappearing into the darkness for hours, always coming back with that same withdrawn, subdued expression. And every time she came back, The borrowed face seemed a little more settled, a little more comfortable wearing her skin. I started following her on these walks. I would wait until she left the house, then bundle up and track her through the tundra darkness. She never went far, usually just walking in circles, stopping periodically to stand motionless in the freezing cold, her hands hanging loose at her sides, her breath creating small clouds of vapor in the Arctic air. One night, I got brave and approached her. I wanted to confront her about the wrongness, to demand to know what had happened to the real Sarah, to understand what was wearing her face. But when I stepped into view, the thing inside my wife's body looked at me with an expression that was so profoundly unsettling, so fundamentally wrong, that I turned and ran back to the house without saying a word. The fear became consuming after that. I couldn't to sleep. I couldn't to eat. I would lie awake in the darkness, listening to the house settle, listening to Sarah move around in the next room. The sounds were familiar but wrong. The way she breathed was slightly off. The way she moved was almost human but missing some essential quality. I did more research. I dug deeper into the old records, finding interviews with families who had experienced the borrowed face phenomenon. Their accounts were horrifying and, worse, unsettlingly consistent. They described the initial subtle wrongness, the gradual acceptance that something had fundamentally changed about their loved one, the eventual realization that the person they had known was gone and had been replaced by something that was learning to wear their skin more naturally. Some families reported that the borrowed-faced person eventually returned to the tundra and simply didn't come back. Others reported that their loved ones became increasingly detached from normal human interaction, until they seemed almost catatonic, sitting for hours without moving, staring at nothing. A few families reported more disturbing progressions, with the borrowed-faced person becoming aggressive or disturbing, engaging in behavior that made it clear they were not in fact human. The creeping, chilling realization that began to form was that the tundra itself was changing people. Something out there, something in the vast emptiness and isolation of the Arctic landscape, was examining people who walked alone into its domain. Something was studying us, learning from us, and then sending us back wearing our own faces but occupied by something fundamentally other. I made the terrible decision to confront it directly. I told Sarah that I knew something was wrong, that I knew she wasn't actually my wife. Her response was to stare at me for a long moment with those borrowed eyes, and then she began to speak. Her voice was almost right, but the cadence was slightly wrong, the intonation missing something crucial. She told me that the real Sarah was still out there, on the tundra, still walking. She said that what takes people from the tundra doesn't to kill them. It removes them from normal existence and replaces them with something that looks close enough, acts close enough, that most people never notice. She said that out on the ice, there are places where the boundary between worlds is thin, where things from somewhere else can reach through and exchange themselves for humans. She said the real Sarah is out there, existing in some parallel state, neither alive nor dead, suspended in the tundra, this vast, eerie darkness. And the thing wearing her face is here, in this house, in this normal human existence, learning what it means to be human by observing me and by wearing my wife's skin. I left that night. I packed a bag and drove south, out of Barrow, away from the Arctic darkness and the creepy, unsettling things that wait in the frozen wilderness. I haven to return. I can to return. But I think about Sarah constantly. I wonder if she is still out there on the tundra, trapped in some impossible state, aware but not conscious, existing but not alive, suspended in the darkness and cold that covers the top of the world. I've been trying to get people to listen to my story, trying to warn people about the Barrow borrowed face. But no one takes it seriously. The authorities checked on Sarah, and she gave them a perfectly normal explanation for why I left, why I was apparently struggling with paranoia and isolation. She was sympathetic and concerned about my mental health. She was the perfect wife defending herself against accusations of strangeness. That's what scares me most. The thing wearing Sarah's face is learning. With each passing day, it is becoming more convincingly human. Soon, no one will be able to tell the difference. And when enough people have walked alone on the tundra and returned with borrowed faces, when enough of the replacements have learned to blend in seamlessly with human society, what then? I see them sometimes now, not just in Barrow, but in other small Alaskan towns. People with subtle wrongness to their faces, a quality that I can now perceive instantly, even if others can. There are more of them every season. More borrowed faces walking among us. More things learning what it means to be human by wearing our identities like uncomfortable clothes. The tundra is patient. The Arctic darkness is infinite. And out on that frozen landscape, somewhere beyond the reach of normal human perception, the real people are still there. Still walking, still existing in whatever strange state the tundra has trapped them in. All it takes is a solo walk on the ice. One moment of vulnerability. One moment of being alone in that vast, creepy, unsettling darkness. And something will notice you. Something will study you. Something will learn your face and send you back wearing your own skin but occupied by something that isn't to you anymore. The borrowed face is the kindest thing it can do. Because the alternative is to keep you out there forever, trapped in that eerie landscape where the boundary between worlds grows thinner with each passing night. Sarah is still out there. I know she is. And every time I see someone walking alone on a dark street, I wonder if they were going to come back wrong. I wonder how many of them already have. The thing that wore her face learned my name eventually. It called me on the phone 3 months after I left. It knew things only my wife would know. It was becoming more convincingly human with each passing day. And the horrifying, terrifying truth is that I have no way of knowing if the person I'm talking to right now, the person reading these words, was human when they woke up this morning. I have no way of knowing if you might disappear onto the tundra tonight and return with someone else wearing your face. The borrowed face is still out there. Still hunting. Still learning. Still waiting for the next person to take a walk alone into the Arctic darkness. Story 7. Voices in the Ice. The Columbia Glacier has been screaming for 35 years. Not the crack and groan of ice breaking apart. Not the rumble of calving icebergs. Human voices. Men crying out in terror and agony. The same voices. The same screams. Coming from deep inside a wall of ice that should contain nothing but frozen water and ancient air. I heard them myself 3 months ago. And what I discovered frozen in that glacier will haunt me until the day I die. My name is Marcus, and I work as a marine biologist studying the long-term environmental impact of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. 35 years after that tanker tore open and bled 11 million gallons of crude into Prince William Sound, we are still finding damage. Still discovering species that never recovered. Still measuring the horrifying persistence of toxins that should have degraded decades ago. My research brought me to Valdez, Alaska, in July. That is when locals started telling me about the crying glacier. It started in the spring of 1990, about a year after the spill. Fishermen working near the Columbia Glacier began reporting strange sounds. Voices echoing across the water. Men shouting for help, screaming in fear, always coming from the glacier face. That massive wall of blue-white ice that towers 300 feet above the water and stretches for miles. At first, people assumed it was other boaters in distress. Rescue attempts were launched. Search parties combed the area. But they never found anyone. The voices would fade as boats approached, only to return when the searchers left. The sounds became more frequent over the years. More disturbing. Witnesses described hearing what sounded like an entire crew in the water, crying out as they drowned. Calling for rescue. Begging for help that never came. Some claimed they could hear individual words, names being shouted, prayers being spoken, the eerie sound of men facing death together in freezing water. The sounds always came during the day when the glacier was most active, when chunks of ice calved off the face and crashed into the sound with thunderous impacts. Scientists dismissed it as acoustic phenomena. Ice making strange sounds as it melted and shifted. Wind creating unusual echoes. The power of suggestion making people hear patterns in random noise. But the locals knew better. They recognized human voices when they heard them. And they noticed something terrifying. The screaming always intensified when oil was detected in the water near the glacier. As if whatever was trapped in the ice could sense the toxins that killed it. I was skeptical until I heard the recordings. A tour boat operator named Helen had been documenting the sounds for 15 years. She played me 3 hours of audio captured at various times. It was undeniable. Those were human voices, dozens of them, overlapping, panic-stricken, crying out in English with American accents. The words were often unclear, drowned out by the cracking ice and distance. But certain phrases came through clearly. Help us, we are sinking, it is so cold, God please, over and over, the same terrible chorus frozen in time. Helen told me her theory. She believed the voices belonged to cleanup crew members who died during the oil spill response. Official records showed that everyone survived the disaster. No deaths directly attributed to the spill itself. But Helen claimed that was a lie. She had talked to retired Coast Guard personnel who admitted that several small boats went missing during the chaotic first weeks. Boats that were never found. Crews that were never recovered. Men who disappeared into the Sound and were erased from official records because their deaths would complicate the already catastrophic situation. According to Helen, at least one cleanup vessel capsized near the Columbia Glacier in late March 1989. 12 men went into the water. The boat sank in minutes. The water temperature was barely above freezing. They would have died within an hour. Their bodies were never recovered because the company running the cleanup operations ordered the search called off. Too expensive. Too time-consuming. Too much negative publicity. The families were told their loved ones abandoned their posts, deserted, went AWOL, but they died screaming in freezing water while their employers lied about what happened. Helen believed their voices were somehow preserved in the glacier ice, trapped like fossils, playing back whenever the ice shifted or broke. A horrifying recording that would continue until the glacier melted completely. She asked me to help prove it, to use my scientific credentials to validate what everyone in Valdez already knew. That the Columbia Glacier was haunted by men who died trying to clean up a disaster they did not cause, then were denied even the dignity of being remembered. I agreed to investigate, partly because it might yield interesting acoustic research, partly because the story disturbed me enough that I needed to know the truth. I chartered a boat and brought recording equipment far more sophisticated than anything Helen used. I positioned myself a safe distance from the glacier face and waited. It was late afternoon, the sun hung low. The ice glowed with an eerie blue luminescence that made it look alive. Chunks calved off periodically, crashing into the water with sounds like artillery fire. Then I heard them, faint at first, growing louder. Male voices shouting. Not echoes, not random sounds, clear human speech. I captured it on my equipment, isolated the frequencies, filtered out the background noise. And what I heard made my skin crawl with fear and revulsion. The voices were not just generic cries for help. They were specific. Detailed. One voice kept repeating coordinates. Another was giving a damage report. A third was calling out names. Roll call for a crew that was drowning. I spent 3 days recording everything I could. The voices appeared most clearly in the late afternoon when the sun warmed the glacier face. They seemed to come from deep inside the ice, echoing through cracks and crevasses. Sometimes I heard just one voice. Sometimes a dozen overlapping. Always men. Always terrified. Always describing the same situation. Their boat was sinking. The water was deadly cold. Help was not coming. They were going to die. On the 4th day, I noticed something chilling in the recordings. The voices were not random. They repeated in a cycle. The same phrases in the same order every time they appeared. Like a recording playing on loop, or like a moment in time replaying itself endlessly. The more I listened, the more details I caught. Someone mentioning the date, March 26th. Someone else saying the company name, Coastal Response Services. A third voice screaming about oil in the water burning his throat. I researched Coastal Response Services. The company existed. It was contracted for cleanup work in 1989. And according to buried records I found in maritime archives, they did lose a vessel. The research boat Endeavour disappeared on March 26th near the Columbia Glacier. Official report said it returned to port and the crew went AWOL. But insurance documents told a different story. The company filed a claim for a lost vessel. 12 life vests were recovered floating in the Sound, and several witnesses reported seeing the boat capsize in rough water near the glacier. The company paid off the families, made them sign non-disclosure agreements, threatened to destroy the reputations of the dead men if anyone talked. It was cheaper to cover up 12 deaths than to deal with the lawsuits and investigations. So those men were erased, written out of history. Their families were told to stay silent, and their final moments were trapped somehow in the ice, replaying over and over for anyone willing to listen. I needed proof beyond the recordings. I needed something that would force authorities to acknowledge what happened. So I did something dangerous. I hired a climber to help me access the glacier face itself. We approached at dawn when the ice was most stable, used ropes and harnesses to get close to where the voices seemed loudest. And there, embedded in the ice 30 feet above the waterline, I saw them. Bodies, frozen in the glacier, preserved in blue ice like insects in amber. I counted 8 visible through the translucent surface. Men in orange survival suits. Faces frozen and expressions of terror. Arms reaching upward. Mouths open in screams. They were trapped in the ice in the exact positions they died. Drowning. Freezing. Crying out for rescue that never came. And the ice had preserved not just their bodies but somehow their voices too. Their final moments locked in frozen water, replaying whenever the ice shifted and cracked. I photographed everything. documented the location, marked the coordinates. Then I had to retreat because the glacier was becoming dangerously unstable in the morning sun. As we descended, I heard the voices again, louder than ever, more desperate. And I understood something terrifying. They knew I had found them. They knew someone had finally seen them. And they were trying to tell me something more, trying to communicate beyond just the repeating loop of their death. I reviewed my audio recordings that night, isolated every voice, enhanced every phrase, and I found it, hidden beneath the screaming and the panic. A single voice speaking clearly, deliberately, saying words that did not fit the chaos of drowning. It said, "They left us to die. They knew we were here. They watched us sink. Tell everyone. Make them pay. Tell our families. Please God, tell them we did not abandon them." That message was not part of the death loop. It was something added later, something the voices in the ice had managed to create through decades of trying. A plea directed at anyone who would listen. And now I had heard it. Now I had the proof, the photographs, the recordings, the research showing the company lied. I could give those men their dignity back. I could make sure the world knew they died as heroes trying to fix someone else's disaster. I went to the authorities with everything. They investigated, reluctantly. The photographs forced their hand. Divers confirmed there were bodies frozen in the Columbia Glacier. DNA analysis of ice samples matched them to men who disappeared during the spill cleanup. Families were finally told the truth. Coastal Response Services was sued into bankruptcy. Executives faced criminal charges for falsifying records and obstruction of justice. The story made national news. The Crying Glacier became a memorial site, a place where people come to honor the men who died and were forgotten. The voices still echo from the ice, still replay that terrible day. But now everyone knows what they are hearing. Now those screams have names attached. Now those men are remembered. But something else happened that I did not expect. After the story broke and the bodies were officially acknowledged, the voices changed. They are still there, still audible, but the panic is gone. The terror has faded. Now when boats approach the glacier, people report hearing something different. Singing, faint and distant, like a crew singing together to keep their spirits up, like men who finally found peace after 35 years of screaming into the void. I visit the Columbia Glacier twice a year now. I bring flowers and leave them floating in the water. I stand on the deck of a boat and listen to the ice. Sometimes I hear the singing, sometimes just the natural sounds of the glacier, but I always feel watched. Always sense that something in that wall of ice is aware of me. Grateful, at peace. The families hold an annual memorial now. Every March 26th, boats gather near the glacier. They pour fresh water into the Sound to honor the men who died in toxic oil slicks. They tell stories, share memories, and they listen to the ice. Because the Columbia Glacier is not just a natural formation anymore. It is a tomb, a memorial, a reminder that some deaths are not accidents but choices made by people who valued profit over human life. The glacier is melting. Climate change is destroying it faster than anyone predicted. Within 20 years, it will be gone completely. The bodies will sink to the ocean floor. The ice that preserved them will turn to water and flow into the sea. And the voices will finally stop. But until then, they remain. A haunting echo of a disaster within a disaster. A reminder that the Exxon Valdez spill killed more people than the official records acknowledge. And those men deserve to be remembered for as long as the ice holds their story. I carry recordings of those voices with me everywhere now. I play them for anyone who will listen. Scientists, journalists, students, tourists. I make sure people understand that horror is not always supernatural. Sometimes horror is human negligence, corporate greed, the decision to let men die rather than admit a mistake. Those are the scariest monsters because they are real. They exist in boardrooms and legal departments and official reports that lie. The Columbia Glacier taught me that truth does not stay buried forever. It finds ways to surface, to make itself heard, even if it takes 35 years. Even if it requires voices trapped in ice. Even if it demands that someone like me stumbles into the story and refuses to let it stay hidden. The dead may not rest easily, but they can find peace. If someone is willing to listen, if someone is willing to fight for them, if someone refuses to let the convenient lie replace the terrible truth. I still hear them sometimes in my dreams, the voices from the ice, but they are not screaming anymore. They are singing, thanking me, telling me I did what they needed. And when I wake up, I feel the weight of knowing I gave 12 forgotten men their names back. Their dignity, their truth, that is worth all the nightmares, all the eerie recordings, all the chilling hours spent listening to men die over and over in frozen water. Because some stories need to be told no matter how disturbing they are. Some voices need to be heard no matter how scary the truth might be. And the Columbia Glacier will keep telling its story until the last piece of ice melts into the sea. Story 8. Dust that used to be gold. The gold nugget in my hand turned to dust at sunrise, and when I looked down at my fingers, I saw they were starting to crumble too. I am writing this in a Skagway motel room, watching my skin flake away like old paint, knowing I have maybe hours before I become whatever those things on the trail have become. I need to tell someone what happened out there, need to warn anyone who might follow the same path I did. Because the prospectors from 1898 are still searching for gold in those mountains, and they are desperate to share what they found. My name is Marcus Webb, and I am a 42-year-old accountant from Denver. Was an accountant. I came to Alaska 3 weeks ago for a solo hiking trip, one of those middle-aged crisis adventures where you try to prove you are still young and capable. The Chilcot Trail seemed perfect, historic, challenging. The route thousands of gold rushers took during the Klondike Stampede, climbing from sea level to the summit through brutal terrain, chasing dreams of wealth. I started in Skagway, a tourist town that clings to its gold rush past like a religion. The streets are lined with false front buildings made to look like 1898, gift shops selling fool's gold and prospector costumes. Everything is sanitized history, adventure without danger, perfect for cruise ship passengers who want to touch the past without getting dirty. But the trail itself is different. Real. The moment you leave town and start climbing toward the pass, you feel the weight of history pressing down. Thousands died on this route, starved, froze, fell from cliffs or were buried in avalanches. The Canadian Mounties eventually required each person to carry a year's worth of supplies, which meant dozens of trips up and down the trail, hauling impossibly heavy loads through ice and snow and mud. I was well prepared, modern gear, GPS, satellite communicator. I started the hike on a clear September morning, planning to reach the summit in 2 days. The first section wound through coastal forest, peaceful and green, boardwalks protecting the trail from erosion. Easy hiking, tourist hiking. I felt confident, strong, ready for the challenge ahead. The unease started around mile 6, where the forest gave way to rockier terrain. I began seeing things that did not fit. Old tools scattered beside the trail, a rusted pickaxe, a mining pan with holes worn through. These should have been collected by park services or stolen by souvenir hunters decades ago. But here they sat, almost fresh, as if someone had set them down recently and walked away. Then I saw the boot, half buried in mud beside a stream, old leather cracked and stained but not rotted. I pulled it free and found the foot still inside, bones held together by dried tissue. The boot looked like it came from the gold rush era, but the preservation was impossible. Over a century of weather should have destroyed it completely. I reported it on my satellite communicator. Park rangers said they would investigate but that I should continue hiking, that the trail was safe. They sounded unconcerned, almost bored, like this was routine. That should have been my first warning that something was very wrong with this place. Night fell fast in the mountains. I set up camp near a creek, the sound of water covering other noises, making me feel isolated and small. I ate my freeze-dried dinner watching darkness creep down from the peaks, turning the landscape into formless shadow. The temperature dropped hard, my breath turned visible, frost forming on the outside of my tent. I woke around midnight to voices. Not close, but not far either. Men talking. Their words unclear but the tone unmistakable. Exhaustion, desperation, the sound of people pushed beyond their limits. I unzipped my tent and looked out into darkness broken only by my headlamp beam. Nothing, just rocks and scrub brush and the skeletal remains of an old cable system used to haul supplies during the gold rush. The voices had stopped the moment I moved, cut off like someone had flipped a switch. But I could feel them out there, feel attention directed at me from the darkness, watching and waiting. I told myself it was other hikers. That sound carried strangely in mountain valleys. But I had not seen anyone else on the trail all day. And it was late September, near the end of hiking season. The trail should have been nearly empty. I could not sleep after that. Lay in my sleeping bag listening to silence that felt hostile, oppressive. And just before dawn, I heard the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel, circling my tent in a slow, deliberate pattern. Heavy steps, like someone carrying an enormous load. They stopped outside my door, and I heard breathing, labored and wet, the sound of damaged lungs struggling for air. Then a voice, barely above a whisper, spoke from inches away through the tent fabric. It said I looked tired, said the trail was hard, said they could help me reach the summit if I wanted. Said they knew shortcuts, places where the climbing was easier. All I had to do was follow them when the sun came up. The voice was wrong. Too dry, too hollow, like words shaped by a mouth that no longer properly functioned. And underneath the English, I could hear other sounds, wet clicking and rustling that suggested something physically wrong with whoever or whatever was speaking. I did not respond, did not move, barely breathed. After what felt like hours, the footsteps resumed, moving away up the trail toward the pass. When dawn finally broke gray and cold, I emerged to find tracks in the frost. Boot prints from the 1890s, the distinctive pattern of hobnailed soles, pressed deep into ground that should have been frozen solid. I should have turned back, should have descended to Skagway immediately and abandoned the hike, but something kept me moving forward, a compulsion I did not understand then, but recognized now as the first sign of their influence. They had marked me, had spoken to me, and that contact had created a connection I could not sever. The trail grew steeper, climbing through boulder fields and across slopes of loose scree. The landscape turned harsh and barren, all life scrubbed away by brutal weather. And everywhere I looked, I saw signs of the stampeders. Equipment scattered like they had just set it down. Campsites with tent poles still standing. And bones. So many bones. Half buried or lying exposed, scattered across the mountain like seeds. Around noon, I reached the scales, a flat area where prospectors had weighed their gear before the final push to the summit. It got its name from the literal scales merchants set up, charging desperate men to verify they carried the required 1,000 pounds of supplies. Now it was just bare rock and wind, a desolate place that felt like the edge of the world. That is where I met them. 3 figures standing among the boulders, dressed in rotting clothes from another century. They did not move as I approached, did not react to my presence, just stood staring up at the summit with horrible, fixed intensity. Their skin had turned gray, dried and cracked like old leather. Their eyes were the worst part, clouded white but somehow still seeing, tracking me as I tried to circle past. One of them held out his hand as I passed. In his palm sat a gold nugget the size of a walnut, gleaming even in the flat light. He gestured for me to take it, his jaw working soundlessly, trying to form words that would not come. The other 2 moved closer, boxing me in, their presence radiating cold that had nothing to do with weather. I reached out and took the gold. It was heavy, warm, more beautiful than anything I had ever held. The moment my fingers closed around it, the 3 figures relaxed, their terrible tension releasing like pressure from a valve. They turned and walked away up the trail, moving with that same labored gait I had heard outside my tent, and within seconds the swirling snow had swallowed them completely. The gold felt incredible in my hand, real and solid and valuable. I knew I should drop it, should leave it on the trail and run, but I could not make myself let go. My fingers had closed around it like a trap, and some deep part of my brain insisted this was what I had come for, what I had always been searching for. I continued climbing, the nugget clutched in my fist, my mind growing foggy and strange. The trail blurred. Hours passed in seconds or seconds stretched into hours. I could not tell. Other figures appeared and disappeared in the snow, always climbing, always carrying impossible loads, their faces locked in expressions of determination that had fossilized into something inhuman. I reached the summit as darkness fell, stood at the top of the pass where thousands had stood before me, driven by dreams of wealth that mostly ended in death and disappointment. The wind howled across bare rock, and in that wind I heard voices, hundreds of voices, the ghosts of every person who had died chasing gold. They were all still here, all still climbing, all still searching, trapped in their obsession, unable to rest, unable to accept that their journey had ended in failure and death. And they wanted company, wanted others to share their endless, pointless quest. The gold in my hand pulsed with warmth. I looked down at it and saw it was no longer golden but gray, the color of ash, of dust, of dead flesh. And my hand was changing too, the skin turning rough and cracked, the flesh beneath drying and withering. I ran, stumbled back down the trail in darkness, falling and scraping myself bloody. The gold still clutched in my hand no matter how hard I tried to drop it. The figures followed, dozens of them now, calling out in their broken voices, offering me more gold, promising me wealth beyond measure if I would just stop running and join them in their search. I made it to my tent, threw myself inside, zipped it closed against the pursuing dead. They surrounded me all night, pressing against the fabric, whispering and pleading and commanding. And slowly, inevitably, I felt myself changing, felt the gold fever taking root in my mind, displacing rational thought with obsessive need. By morning, I knew I could not reach Skagway in time. The transformation had begun and would not stop. The fool, gold I had accepted was a vector, a carrier for whatever curse or disease had trapped the stampeders in their eternal, futile search. They were not offering treasure but infection, spreading their obsession to anyone foolish enough to accept what they offered. I managed to descend far enough to reach this motel, to write this warning while I still could. But my mind is slipping, my thoughts turning circular, focusing more and more on gold, on wealth, on the need to climb back up that trail and search until I find what has always eluded me. The nugget sat on the nightstand when I woke this morning. I had finally managed to drop it during the night, but as sunrise touched it, it collapsed into dust, gray powder that scattered in the ventilation draft. And my hands, my arms, my face, they are all starting to do the same. I am turning into dust, into the same substance as the fool, this gold, becoming one more ghost on that cursed trail. I can feel it in my mind now. The gold fever, burning away everything that made me human. The need to search, to climb, to find the mother lode that will make everything worthwhile. It does not matter that the gold rush ended over a century ago. It does not matter that I am dying. The fever does not care about reality or survival. It only cares about gold. By tonight, I will be back on that trail. I will join the others, shambling up and down the paths for eternity, offering poisoned treasure to anyone who passes, desperate to share what I have become. And somewhere in my fading mind, I will remember that I tried to warn people, tried to explain the danger. Story 9. Haynes Pipeline. In 1978, a man killed 5 of his co-workers on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline and told the police that the Northern Lights had commanded him to do it. The case was sealed, the files hidden away, and the worker was institutionalized in a facility so remote that almost no one knows it exists. But I worked on that pipeline for 4 years after those murders, and I heard the screaming in the Aurora. I understand now what happened to that man, and I'm terrified because I can feel it happening to me. My name is Frank, and I am a pipeline construction supervisor. In 1982, I was hired by Alyeska Pipeline Service Company to oversee a crew of laborers maintaining a remote section of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline near Haynes. The pipeline stretches over 800 miles across some of the most brutal landscape in North America, and the crew stations are isolated, frightening places where the closest civilization is often 100 miles away. The work was brutal, 12-hour shifts in sub-zero temperatures, maintaining the massive steel pipeline that carried oil from the Arctic to the port at Valdez. The pipeline passed through some of the most eerie, unsettling terrain in Alaska, crossing frozen rivers, cutting through dense forests, traversing open tundra where the wind could kill you in minutes. The isolation was crushing, the darkness eternal during the winter months. The sense of being watched by the landscape was constant. I had heard rumors about what happened in 1978, the incident that the company didn't talk about. A worker named Marcus something, I couldn't remember his last name. There were whispered stories about how he had murdered his entire crew with a torch, burning them in the darkness, all the while screaming that the lights in the sky were speaking to him, commanding him, telling him terrible things that he had to obey. But the stories were vague, full of gaps and contradictions. The official company line was that Marcus had suffered a psychotic break brought on by isolation and the harsh conditions. He was mentally unstable, they said. There was nothing supernatural about it. Just a man whose mind broke under the stress of working on the pipeline. I didn't believe it, but I also didn't want to believe anything else. The alternative was that something was actually happening in the Arctic darkness, something connected to the Northern Lights, something that could break a man, his mind, and turn him into a murderer. My crew arrived at Camp 7 in early November, just as the sun was disappearing below the horizon for the season. The darkness wouldn't break for months. The temperature was dropping steadily, and the forecast promised a severe winter. The base camp consisted of prefabricated buildings connected by enclosed walkways, a small hospital, a kitchen facility, and sleeping quarters for 30 men. We were the only crew at this location. The nearest other pipeline station was 70 miles away. The first few weeks were manageable. The work was demanding, the conditions were harsh, but my crew was experienced and professional. We maintained our routines. We worked, we ate, we slept. Some of the men tried to maintain social routines, playing cards in the common area, watching old movies on the single VCR, writing letters home that wouldn't be sent until the supply plane arrived in spring. But around mid-November, something changed. It was subtle at first. The aurora started appearing more frequently, more intensely than normal. The green and red lights filled the night sky, dancing and swirling in patterns that seemed almost intentional, almost purposeful. The aurora borealis, the northern lights, a phenomenon I had always found beautiful and fascinating. But there was something different about these lights. They felt aware. They felt like they were looking at us. My crew started behaving strangely. One of the men, a guy named Derek, began standing outside at night, staring up at the lights without moving, for hours at a time. When I asked him what he was doing, he looked at me with eyes that weren't quite focused and said the lights were singing. When I asked him what they were singing, he couldn't explain it. He just kept saying they were beautiful, that they were trying to tell him something important, that he needed to listen more carefully. I was worried enough to send Derek south on the next supply plane, telling the company he was too unstable to work. They didn't. He asked many questions. They processed his transfer without comment, and I got a replacement worker a month later. But Derek's strangeness had infected the camp. More men became obsessed with the aurora. They would gather outside at night, staring upward, their faces illuminated by the eerie, unsettling glow. Some of them started claiming they could understand what the lights were saying. One worker, a guy named Tom, began keeping a journal of the messages he was receiving. He would sit in the common area and write frantically, his hand moving across pages so fast that he would sometimes bleed from the pressure of the pen. I tried to maintain order, to keep the situation from spiraling into chaos. I implemented a rule that no one was allowed outside after sunset unless they were on official work duties. The rule was met with resentment, but I enforced it strictly. I was terrified that something was happening to my men, something that I didn't understand and couldn't control. In early December, Tom had a complete psychotic break. He was found in the maintenance tunnel underneath the pipeline, completely naked in the sub-zero cold, covered in his own blood, scratching at the steel of the pipeline and screaming that the light was inside the metal, that it was trapped there trying to communicate with him. We got him to the medical facility, and the doctor said he needed immediate evacuation. I requested an emergency helicopter, and it arrived 6 hours later. Tom was airlifted out, still screaming about the lights, his words becoming increasingly incoherent as we loaded him into the aircraft. I had a crew meeting the next morning and implemented even stricter protocols. No one was allowed outside after dark for any reason. The emergency tunnels under the camp were sealed. The windows in all the buildings were covered with blackout curtains to prevent the men from seeing the aurora while they worked or slept. I was desperate, grasping at solutions that I knew were probably futile. But the damage was already done. The fear had taken root. The men knew something was wrong, something terrifying and unsettling, even if they didn't understand what it was. The isolation became even more suffocating, the darkness even more oppressive. The eerie sensation that we were being watched, that something was paying attention to us, grew stronger with each passing day. In mid-December, I discovered something that changed everything. I was reviewing some old files in the camp office, trying to find information about the 1978 incident, when I found a sealed envelope in the back of a filing cabinet. Inside was a series of photographs and a handwritten letter. The photographs were surveillance stills from the night of the 1978 murders. They showed a man, Marcus DeLaurent, standing outside the main building, staring upward at the aurora. But what made the photographs horrifying were the images of his face. In each successive photo, his expression was changing. His mouth was opening wider and wider, as if he were screaming, but his eyes remained fixed on the sky. In the final photo, his face was contorted into an expression of such absolute agony and terror that it looked almost inhuman. The letter was from the psychiatrist who had treated Marcus after his arrest. It was a single paragraph, written in shaking handwriting. The subject claims to have heard voices emanating from the aurora borealis. He states that the lights communicated in a language that was not human, that the sounds bypassed his ears entirely and spoke directly to his consciousness. He committed the murders because the lights commanded him to do so. He was unable to resist. The subject remains convinced that the lights are still trying to communicate with him, even in confinement. I recommend permanent isolation from any exposure to the nighttime sky. The subject appears to be suffering from something beyond conventional psychiatric illness. I recommend this case be classified and sealed immediately. I stood in that office, holding the letter, and felt the fear crystallize into something worse than fear. Understanding. The knowledge that something in the aurora, something intelligent and deliberate and absolutely terrifying, was actively communicating with the men stationed on the pipeline. And I had no idea how to stop it or protect my crew from it. That night, I broke my own rules. I went outside without covering my eyes. I wanted to see what Marcus had seen, to understand what was happening. The aurora was magnificent that evening. The entire sky was filled with moving light, swirling and dancing in patterns that seemed almost musical. The colors were incredible, vivid greens and deep reds and purples that I had never seen before. And then I heard it, a sound that wasn't coming from the sky but somehow emanating from inside my own head. A vibration that seemed to exist in my consciousness itself, a frequency that bypassed my ears entirely. It was beautiful, it was terrifying. It was like listening to something vast and ancient and utterly alien attempting to communicate with the limited neural architecture of a human being. I understood immediately what had happened to Marcus. I understood what was happening to my crew. The aurora wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was alive in some way that human consciousness couldn't fully comprehend. It was aware. It was trying to speak. And the message it was attempting to convey was so horrifying, so fundamentally unsettling, that the human mind couldn't process it without breaking. I ran back inside and sealed myself in my office. I ordered the supply plane to make an emergency landing. I told the company that the camp needed to be evacuated immediately due to a medical emergency. I didn't explain why. I didn't tell them about the aurora, the voices, or my terrifying realization. The evacuation happened within 24 hours. All non-essential personnel were airlifted out. My crew of 23 men was reduced to a skeleton crew of 5, including myself, to maintain minimal operations. But the relief didn't last. The 5 of us who remained could still see the aurora. I had installed blackout curtains, but they didn't matter. The lights found ways through the gaps. They reflected off the snow and the ice. They created shadows that seemed to move independently. And most disturbing of all, I could hear them. The voices in my head were growing clearer, more insistent, more commanding. I fought it. I stayed awake for 70 hours straight, doing anything I could to avoid closing my eyes and slipping into the state where I could hear the voices most clearly. But eventually, exhaustion forced me to rest. And when I slept, I dreamed of the aurora speaking directly into my consciousness, showing me things, telling me things that no human mind should ever know. In the morning, I found one of my remaining crew members standing outside in the snow, completely naked, staring upward at the daylight sky. He had frozen solid. His body temperature had dropped so low that the medical equipment registered him as already dead. He had been trying to hear the lights even in the daytime. He had wanted so badly to communicate with them that he had walked out into the cold and simply stood there until his body shut down completely. I had him evacuated by medical helicopter. Then I requested evacuation for myself and the remaining 3 crew members. The company approved it immediately. But here is the terrifying part. Here, it's the thing that I've been living with for the past 4 years. The voices didn't stop when I left the pipeline. They followed me. They were still with me. Every time the aurora is visible, even from thousands of miles away, I can hear them. They were patient. They were persistent. And I becoming increasingly convinced that they were getting closer, that they were learning how to communicate more effectively with my human brain. They tried everything to block them out. They tried sound therapy, psychiatric medication, sensory deprivation chambers that eliminate all external input. Nothing works. The voices in the aurora are patient and eternal, and they were slowly teaching my consciousness how to understand their language, how to process their message. They read the sealed files on Marcus DeLauren. He was hospitalized in a remote facility in the Canadian Arctic, a place so isolated that even the staff rotation is minimal. He lived there for 40 years, never speaking, never acknowledging the presence of other humans, his eyes always fixed on something in the distance that no one else could see. He died in 1988. The autopsy report noted that his brain showed unusual neural activity in regions that shouldn't have been active. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the preliminary notes suggested something else. The pathologist wrote that the subject's brain appeared to have been fundamentally altered at a neurological level, as if entire sections of his consciousness had been rewired to process something that human neurology wasn't designed to handle. I'm starting to feel that happening to me. I am starting to understand the messages. They were not hostile. They were not commanding me to hurt anyone. They were simply trying to communicate, trying to teach me a language that exists outside human time and space, trying to show me things about the universe that would drive any normal human consciousness into absolute madness. The creepiest part is that I am starting to want to listen. I am starting to want to understand. Every time I see the aurora, I feel a pull, a compelling desire to go outside and open my mind to the voices completely. I know what will happen if I do. I know I will probably end up institutionalized like Marcus, or dead like the man on my crew. But the need to understand is growing stronger with each passing night. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline is still there. There are still men working on it, still crews stationed at remote locations where the aurora fills the entire sky during winter months. Some of them are probably hearing the voices right now. Some of them are probably experiencing the early stages of whatever this is. The company sealed the files. They classified the case. They made sure that almost no one knows what really happened on that pipeline in 1978. But the phenomenon is still happening. The aurora is still trying to speak. And somewhere in a sealed psychiatric facility, there might still be workers who heard the lights and never recovered, trapped in institutions, their minds forever altered by contact with something that exists just beyond the edge of human perception. I am writing this because I need someone to know. I need someone to understand that the northern lights in Alaska aren't just beautiful. They re-intelligent, they re-aware, and they re-trying very hard to communicate with us. I can hear them right now, calling from the edge of the sky, telling me things, showing me things, inviting me to understand. Soon, I think I'm going to answer that call. And I suspect I want to be the last.